The smoke rolled out of the pit slow and sweet, carrying the scent of hickory and something richer, something impossible. A cowboy leaned against the corral, chewing a blade of grass, watching the smallest of the Japanese girls cradle a slab of ribs over the flames like it was sacred. She moved with muscle memory, not confidence. Her hands were scarred but steady. She hadn't spoken much since arriving, but tonight she didn't have to. The smoke said it all. That evening the POWs cooked, not for themselves, for the ranch, and the cowboys let them, because someone had told a story in broken English about kitchens back home, about miso and fire pits and smoked eels, and one cowboy, eyes narrowed in thought, spat and said, "Hell, let her smoke the ribs." And just like that, the war shifted, just a little. That night, the prisoners fed their captors, not with surrender, but with smoke and fire and meat falling off the bone. The pit hissed with smoke and fat, and the girl standing before it moved like she'd done this her whole life. She hadn't. Not in this way, not in Texas, not surrounded by cowboys with folded arms and eyes narrowed, watching every motion like it might betray her. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows, a borrowed apron tied awkwardly around her frame, far too large. She reached for the long iron tongs, gripping them with a steadiness that felt borrowed from a different time. The ribs sizzled as she turned them, the glaze catching light like lacquered wood. The smell was rich, sweet, spiced, American and not. Someone coughed behind her. Another spat. But no one stepped forward. No one stopped her. A cowboy in a sweat-stained Stetson leaned against the fence, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, not as a threat, just habit. He squinted through the smoke. "She's done this before," he muttered. Another man beside him, younger, arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "You think?" The older one shrugged. "You don't hold tongs like that unless you know what fire does." The girl didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She was somewhere else now, somewhere far from the red dust of the ranch and the barbed wire that framed the horizon. Her eyes drifted, not outward, but inward, back to a smoky alleyway behind her childhood home in Nagoya. Her mother used to cook over a clay hibachi stove, squatting low to the ground, fanning the coals with a woven mat until the rice pot steamed and cracked. Fish was smoked in wrapped leaves. Miso simmered slowly. They never had ribs, but they had fire, and fire taught her patience. She remembered the last time she saw her father's hands covered in ash, holding a half-burned eel on a stick. He had laughed then, said it needed more salt. That was before the war, before the silence, before her stomach became a hollow ache, more permanent than breath. She never told anyone she remembered that moment. But when the American cook had stepped away for a smoke and left a slab of meat sitting crooked over the coals, she couldn't stop herself. She walked over, nudged the log, adjusted the meat. Just a little, just enough. That was 2 days ago. The cook had returned and paused, then narrowed his eyes. He tasted it and said nothing. The next day he left the pit untended again. A test, maybe. And again she moved. By the third time he wasn't even pretending. He handed her the tongs, not with warmth, but with the neutrality of a man who understood results. It was the fourth day when the cowboy said it out loud. "Hell," he drawled, "let her smoke the ribs." There had been a silence then, not hostile, just thick, like dust before a storm. Some guards exchanged glances. One girl behind the fence flinched, waiting for laughter or punishment. It didn't come, so now here she was, tending ribs. The pit crackled as she flipped a piece with a twist of her wrist, the meat pulling away from bone, just slightly. Tender, but not yet done. Her face remained unreadable, not with fear, not with pride, just focused, present, in the moment. The fire glowed on her cheekbones, painting her in copper and smoke. One cowboy cursed under his breath. "If this ain't the strangest war I ever fought in." The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the yard. The men who had been told she was the enemy stood in a loose half-circle, drawn not by sympathy, but by the scent, the deep, primal smell of something cooking slowly, lovingly over wood and thyme. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her language was the sizzle, the aroma, the rhythm of turning ribs like pages in a book only she could read. Before the fire there was only silence. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that presses down on your chest and stays there. When Naomi stepped off the back of the army truck, she didn't look around. Her head didn't lift, her shoulders didn't square. She moved like a leaf caught in the wind, light, brittle, directionless. Her boots didn't match. One had no laces. Her uniform was too big, sleeves dragging, pants cinched with twine. She didn't carry a bag. She carried nothing. She had nothing. The cowboys waiting by the fence didn't speak at first. They watched. One of them, broad-shouldered, maybe in his 30s, shifted his weight and pushed his hat back on his head. "She can't be more than 14, he muttered. Another squinted, chewing tobacco, slow and quiet. Maybe 15, maybe. But no one was sure. All they knew was this wasn't what they'd been told to expect. They'd been briefed with words like fanatical, unpredictable, military-trained. Officers had warned them that even the women could be spies. Eyes sharp, tongues sharper, trained to lie, even kill. Instead, what stepped off the truck wasn't a threat. It was a ghost. Naomi looked too thin to cast a shadow. When she paused in the sunlight, one of the cowboys swore he could count every rib under her shirt. She didn't flinch at the sight of rifles, didn't react when the gates swung open. No fear, no curiosity, just exhaustion painted into every line of her face. She followed the others in a loose line, her feet kicking up dust with each hollow step. Her hair hung in loose strands around her face, oily and uncombed. Her eyes were not downcast. They were empty. The camp itself was strange, half ranch, half outpost. There were fences, but they weren't electric. The barbed wire looped around a large patch of cleared earth, bordered by barns and hayfields. Soldiers walked the perimeter, but not like guards in a prison, more like ranch hands with uniforms instead of denim. Chickens clucked somewhere behind the mess hall. Cattle lowed in the distance. Horses paced in their pens. The air smelled of manure and molasses, gun oil and sun-baked wood. The POW barracks were once stables, scrubbed and converted into sleeping quarters. Naomi was shown to one with a wooden cot, a wool blanket folded at the end, and a crate beside it that served as a table. There was a tin basin, a rag, a pair of socks. No words were exchanged. A gesture was enough. She stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed like she was waiting for permission to breathe. She didn't speak that first day, not when they called her name, not when a medic tried to take her pulse, not when a cowboy offered her a boiled egg and motioned for her to eat. She took it, held it in her hand, and didn't move for a full hour. She just sat there, the egg cooling in her palm, like she was trying to remember what it meant to be fed. The silence followed her everywhere. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't fear. It was survival, calcified into instinct. She'd learned early that speech could be dangerous, that in the wrong moment a wrong word could cost you more than hunger. So she said nothing. Not when they assigned her a work detail, not when they handed her gloves, not even when the guards joked softly about how they might need a translator. The men didn't know what to make of her. One soldier, barely out of boot camp, whispered to another, "You ever seen someone so quiet it hurts?" His friend didn't answer. They were told to watch the prisoners, but Naomi didn't need watching. She barely moved. She was not a danger. She was not a soldier. She was a girl made of ash and breath, dropped into the middle of a ranch that smelled like smoke and horses. And for now, she would simply exist, silent, waiting, until the fire found her. At first it was dishwater and silence. Naomi stood at the back of the camp kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands raw from soap and steel wool. The other POW girls whispered among themselves in broken fragments of language, but Naomi kept to herself. She watched, always watched, from the shadows near the woodpile, from behind stacks of tins, from the sink as she scrubbed pots clean of burnt gravy. She watched the Americans cook. It was different than home, louder, greasier, less ceremony, more heat. They threw things into pots without measuring, big scoops of salt, glugs of oil, handfuls of meat. They stirred with long-handled spoons that clanked against the sides of metal vats. The smells were strange. Fat and smoke, molasses and pork, onions so strong they made her eyes sting, even from across the room. She learned the rhythm of it all before she learned a single word of English, the clang of lids, the scrape of knives, the sharp hiss when broth hit hot iron. The American cook was a sergeant named Boyd, red-faced, wide-bellied, with forearms like tree trunks, and a voice that never quite lowered out of a bark. He didn't speak to Naomi, not directly. He pointed, grunted, motioned to the mop bucket or the stack of trays. She obeyed without a sound, her head down, her steps quiet, but she listened, closely. She heard the way he said, "Bring the heat up," when the stew was thin. "Let it sweat," when the onions weren't soft enough. "Don't touch that damn pot," when ribs were on the smoker. She remembered it all. Then one day, he stepped out. It was nothing. A few minutes. A smoke break, maybe. Naomi was alone in the kitchen. The soup was on. Something with beef and beans, chunks of potato floating at the top. But the flame was too low. She could see it, the edges of the pot bubbling unevenly, the scent not quite rich enough. She moved without thinking. She knelt, adjusted the logs, fed the flame. A little more heat, a slower burn. She didn't stir the pot. She didn't add anything, just changed the fire. By the time Boyd returned, the room smelled different, deeper, rounder. He stopped in the doorway, nostrils flaring. He looked at the stove, then at her. Naomi stood frozen, but he didn't say anything. He walked to the pot, dipped in a ladle, tasted it. He grunted, said nothing, kept moving. But the next day he left the stove unattended again, and this time he watched from the window. Naomi adjusted the heat again, subtly, patiently. It happened again and again. Soon she was no longer just washing dishes, she was tending the flame, not as the head cook, not even as an assistant, just a shadow with a gift. Boyd never told her to do it, but he didn't stop her either. Then the Cowboys started noticing. They didn't say it outright. At first, it was just a pause, a slower chew. One man licked his spoon twice. Another muttered, "Damn, that's good," without realizing he'd said it out loud. One evening, after dinner, a soldier leaned back in his chair and asked no one in particular, "Y'all notice the stew's been tasting different lately?" "Better," someone else answered, wiping his plate clean with a crust of bread. No one knew why. No one asked. But Boyd knew, and Naomi knew. Fire doesn't lie. It only reveals what's already there. The wind shifted late in the afternoon, curling around the mess hall and drawing the smoke out over the yard like a ribbon. Naomi paused mid-step, a stack of metal trays balanced in her arms, and turned her head. It wasn't the usual kitchen fire, not lard or fried onions. This was different, slower, sweeter. The scent of hickory bark, fat melting over coals, meat breaking down under low heat. It wrapped around her before she knew what it was doing, and something inside her moved. On the far side of the corral, near the open pit smoker, a cowboy knelt with a fistful of newspaper and matches. He was muttering as he coaxed the kindling to life, adjusting the logs beneath the grill with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 100 times. Naomi stood still, half hidden behind the barracks wall, and watched the smoke thicken, then rise. The scent caught her off guard. It was Texas, but it smelled like Nagoya, before the war, before the silence. 100 years ago, no, maybe only 5, her father had crouched beside a different fire, not on a ranch, but on a rocky beach, sleeves rolled up past his elbows, carefully turning skewers of eel over smoldering charcoal. Naomi remembered watching the oil drip into the coals, sending up thin trails of white smoke. Her mother had laughed, shielding her eyes from the sun, waving flies away from the miso soup balanced on a flat stone. Naomi had held a bowl of rice in both hands, still warm from the pot, and listened to the gulls screaming overhead. Back then, her family had not been soldiers or servants of the empire. They were just people with full stomachs and a good fire. And that smell, earthy, rich, smoky, had been the scent of home. She hadn't smelled it in years. Not like this. Her knees nearly buckled. She set the trays down, slowly, carefully, as if afraid a single clang might break the spell. Then she walked, past the wash line, past the barn, until she stood just at the edge of the smoker's heat, where the cowboy was now layering slabs of raw ribs onto the grate, humming something low and unhurried. He didn't notice her at first. She stood motionless, arms at her sides, hair falling across her face. The fire crackled between them. Then, without thinking, without permission, without fear, she stepped forward. Her hand reached out, not to touch, but to point. The cowboy saw her. He didn't speak, and then, for the first time since she arrived in Texas, Naomi opened her mouth. "I can help," she said, voice thin as smoke, barely audible over the fire. The words came in English, halting but clear. The cowboy blinked, his brow furrowed. He straightened slightly, looking at her like he was trying to decide if he'd imagined it. She nodded once, stepped closer, gestured to the logs. One needed shifting, the meat too close to the flame. It would burn. He didn't argue. He stepped aside. She knelt, just like her father had, and for the first time in a long time, Naomi didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a daughter, like a girl who still remembered how to make something good from fire. The tongs were heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. When the cowboy held them out, handle first, his knuckles stained with soot, Naomi froze for a breath. No words, just the clink of metal shifting in his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't make a show of it. He just offered them the way you might offer reins to someone who clearly knew how to ride. Not kindness, not charity, just a kind of quiet logic. You know what you're doing, so do it. She reached out slowly, almost reverently, and took them. Around them, no one said a word. A few guards lingered near the fence, pretending not to watch. A kitchen boy paused with a pail of slop, eyes wide. A different cowboy, younger and suspicious, narrowed his gaze. But the man who'd handed her the tongs, his name might have been Reese or Roy, something with an R, just leaned back on his heels and scratched the back of his neck like this was all perfectly normal. Naomi turned back to the fire. Her movements were patient, She adjusted the ribs, not with quick flips or jabs, but with the slow grace of someone guiding a story to its ending. She shifted the wood beneath the grill, coaxed coals to the center, tapped ash from the edges. Her method had no instructions, no recipes, only rhythm. Smoke rose in curls, darker now, richer. It clung to the meat in a way that made mouths water and eyebrows rise. This was not mess hall food. This was something older. She remembered how her grandfather used to say, "Don't fight the fire. Listen to it." So she did. Every hiss was a sentence, every crackle punctuation. She let the ribs settle into heat like bodies sinking into warm bath water. When the first drops of fat hit the coals and sent up a bloom of scent, sweet, earthy, sharp, the cowboy closest to her let out a low whistle through his teeth. "Y'all smell that?" he muttered. Someone nodded. "Ain't lard, ain't grease neither. She doing something. Not sure what, but damn if it don't smell like it matters." From the barracks, a few of the POW girls had wandered to the fence line. Naomi didn't look at them, but she felt their eyes on her back. For a long time they'd seen her only as a shadow, silent, obedient, unreachable. Now they watched her wield the fire like it was an extension of her own will. She brushed the ribs with a mix Boyd had left nearby, something dark and sticky, probably sugar and vinegar and chili. But she thinned it with water first, made it glide like lacquer. The smoke changed again, deeper now, like summer storms rolling in slow. Cowboys gathered closer. One took off his hat and just held it in his hands like he was at a funeral or a baptism, something holy either way. "She's not guessing," someone said. "Nope," came the reply. "She's telling the fire what to do." The silence didn't vanish. It evolved. It became reverent. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to. The tongs moved like they remembered where they'd been. The meat glistened, then darkened, then sang as it seared. By the time she stepped back, the whole yard smelled like something none of them could name, but all of them suddenly missed. And the cowboy who'd handed her the tongs? He just nodded once, slow and sure, like he knew they'd all just crossed into something they couldn't undo. The fire had done its work. Naomi stepped back, setting the tongs down on the edge of the pit with the same quiet care a seamstress might lay down a finished garment. The ribs were dark and glistening, the bark crisped at the edges, the meat tugging away from the bone like it had waited years to fall apart. Smoke still curled around the pit in gentle ribbons, drifting upward as the sun dropped lower in the sky, bathing the camp in that late golden hush only Texas knows how to hold. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Just stood there, eyes lowered, waiting for someone else to take the next step. And they did. One of the older cowboys, silver-haired, crow's feet like fault lines, stepped forward and picked up a slab. No plate, no knife, just his hands and a rib. He took a bite, chewed once, twice, then stopped. He didn't say a word, just blinked, then looked at Naomi, and then at the others. The silence stretched, taut as barbed wire. A younger man, maybe the cook's assistant, leaned in with curiosity and tore a rib loose. He bit in and made a sound, half gasp, half laugh, then caught himself and swallowed hard, like he wasn't sure if it was allowed. Then came the flood. Boots shuffled, hands reached. No orders were given, no blessing said. But the men, soldiers, ranchers, guards, took their places around the pit like it was Sunday supper. They didn't talk, didn't joke, just ate. Slowly, carefully, chewing like every bite held a memory they didn't know they'd forgotten, like something inside the ribs was reaching back through time, settling into a place deeper than hunger. Naomi didn't eat. She stood by the smoker, arms folded in front of her, watching, not proud, not afraid, just still. She watched them eat what her hands had made, watched the grease drip down their knuckles, the way they licked the sauce from their fingers like boys caught stealing sweets. She watched the men who wore guns on their hips and suspicion in their eyes forget, for just a moment, that she was supposed to be the enemy. No one told them to be quiet. The quiet simply came. There was no mocking, no laughter, no sudden burst of disbelief, just reverence, the kind reserved for small miracles. They didn't ask where she'd learned to cook like that. They didn't ask how she knew the right temperature or how she'd coaxed that flavor from American ribs with Japanese hands. They didn't need to. The answers were in the fire, in the smoke, in the space between them. One of the guards looked across the yard at the row of POW girls watching from the fence, eyes wide and unblinking. He held up a rib like an offering, waved them over. A few stepped forward, hesitant, not sure if it was a trick. Naomi nodded once, and that was enough. Soon the girls were eating too, still cautious, still quiet, but chewing like they meant it. And for the first time since any of them had arrived at that dusty, sun-bleached ranch in the middle of nowhere, there was no border between the two sides, no language, no uniforms, just meat, fire, and silence. One man, Roy maybe, tore a piece free with his teeth and said under his breath, "My mama couldn't have made 'em better." Naomi heard it, and though she didn't smile, something in her shoulders relaxed, just slightly. That night, under a sky gone lavender with dusk, she fed the men who could have broken her. And they ate everything. The next morning, Naomi woke with smoke still on her skin. The scent clung to her fingers, her hair, even the collar of her uniform. Beneath her nails, the charcoal-black grit had settled into the lines of her hands like ink on parchment. She sat on the edge of her cot, staring at her palms in the pale blue light of dawn. The barracks were quiet. Just the rustle of hay, the faint snore of a girl across the room, and the distant hum of cattle coming to life with the sun. But something had shifted. When she stepped outside, carrying a wash basin toward the kitchen shed, she felt it before she saw it. A cowboy by the water pump tipped his hat. Just a subtle nod, but one given like she belonged in the morning's rhythm. Another man near the fence line, who had once looked through her like she was part of the scenery, now glanced up and held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. No threat, no suspicion, just acknowledgement. At the mess hall, the same soldier who'd smirked when she scrubbed potatoes last week now asked, "What's your name again?" She hesitated. "Naomi," she said, soft but steady. He repeated it. "Naomi." He said it wrong, round and slow, but smiled. "That's pretty." She gave the smallest of nods and slipped past him into the kitchen. Inside, the kitchen had changed too. The air still held last night's scent, sweet smoke and vinegar, and the pots sat clean but not yet stacked, as if the place had paused overnight and was now waiting for her to press play. She moved toward the prep table, expecting to work alone. But she wasn't. A fellow POW girl, maybe 16 or 17, stood near the cutting board, shoulders stiff, hands uncertain around a dull knife. She looked up when Naomi entered, said nothing, just looked. Naomi paused, then stepped closer. She didn't smile. That wasn't something either of them knew how to do yet. But she nodded at the pile of carrots on the table. The girl looked down. Nodded too. They worked in silence. Side by side, the blade against wood became their conversation. Later, two more girls drifted in. One cleaned beans, one swept the corner near the stove. None of them said they were helping, but none of them left either. By midday, even Boyd, the head cook, gruff as ever, didn't bark when Naomi adjusted the fire beneath the soup pot. He just watched from the doorway, chewing on a toothpick, and let her do what needed doing. That night, Naomi stood outside after dinner, her hands resting on the fence rail near the smoker. The sky above her was layered with stars, so wide and uncaring it made her feel small in a different way, less trapped, more held. Behind her, laughter floated from the barracks. Not loud, not wild, but laughter nonetheless. A thin, cautious thing. A seed breaking through hard soil. And Naomi, once invisible, once silent, stood in that soft dark, with the smoke still on her hands, and felt something close to weight lift from her chest. She wasn't safe. Not yet. She wasn't free. But for the first time since her feet had touched American soil, she was something else. Seen. The question came between bites. A cowboy, boots kicked up, hat tilted back, grease still on his chin, wiped his hands with a rag and looked at Naomi across the fire pit. His voice was curious, not demanding. "How'd you make it taste like that?" She looked up from the pot she was tending, blinked once, then shrugged. It was the kind of shrug that said, "I don't know how to explain it. I just do." "No recipe?" he asked again. She shook her head. "Just remember." It wasn't a dismissal. It was the truth. There was no piece of paper, no cookbook passed down, no precise measurements. Everything she knew had been passed to her through hands, through smells, through standing beside someone older as they stirred and salted and waited, watching until the smoke curled just right, until the broth turned the right color, until her father had said, "Now, taste it." She didn't know the English word for what that was, but they understood. The men nodded, some with the same look they used when inspecting fence lines or choosing a good horse. It wasn't science, it was feel. Later that evening, as Naomi chopped onions and dropped garlic into hot oil, one of the younger men pointed to a rib bone from last night, still sitting near the edge of the grill. "Rib," he said, tapping it. "Ribe." She tilted her head. "Rib?" He smiled. "Yeah, rib. And this." He reached into the box of kitchen supplies, pulled out a wooden shaker and rattled it gently. "Salt." She repeated it. "Salt." They grinned. Not at her, but with her. Another word, another thread across the gap. Soon others joined in. It became a game. Not formal, not structured, just words tossed gently like pebbles across a stream. "Fire. Smoke. Meat. Good." She repeated them, sometimes mispronouncing, sometimes getting it right the first time. Each time, the line between guard and prisoner thinned just a little more. Naomi, for her part, began offering Japanese words in return. "Shio," she said, pointing to the salt. "Niku." Meat. "Hi." Fire. They echoed her softly, some with reverence, some with clumsy laughter. By the time the meal was served, roast vegetables, stew, and something halfway between miso broth and cowboy chili, the line of language had blurred entirely. They didn't need the right nouns anymore. The scent said enough. The fire spoke plainly. They ate again, cross-legged near the pit, plates balanced on knees. There was no toast, no speeches, just chewing, nodding, seconds offered without asking, and every now and then a glance toward Naomi that carried no suspicion, no pity, just gratitude. In that moment, war felt far away, not gone, but blurred, like a photograph left too long in the sun. For a breath, they weren't guards and prisoners, weren't American and Japanese, weren't soldiers and suspects. They were just people. Hungry people, full people, people sitting shoulder to shoulder in the same warmth, trying to remember what peace felt like before it was stolen from all of them. Naomi didn't say much that night. but she didn't have to. Every hand that reached for food, every smile passed across the firelight, every cowboy who asked how to say "thank you" in her language told her everything she needed to know. And the recipe? It was still unwritten, still carried in her fingertips in the scent of smoke and soy and cedar. But now she wasn't the only one who remembered it. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The pencil felt foreign in her hand. Too clean, too smooth. Nothing like the kitchen knives and firewood she'd grown used to gripping. Naomi held it tight anyway, steadying her wrist on the rough grain of the mess hall bench. A guard had handed her a thin sheet of paper, yellow-gray, and already creased from someone else's pocket. She didn't ask why. She just nodded, accepted it, and waited until the others were done scrubbing pots before she began to write. "Dear Keiko," she started. Her sister's name felt fragile on the page, like a petal that might blow away if she pressed too hard. "I fed the Americans. They said thank you." She paused, looked at the sentence, then kept writing. "The fire here is not the same. The wood burns different, but the way they chewed the ribs, the way their eyes closed when the broth hit their tongues, it reminded me of home. It reminded me of you." She didn't write about the tongs or the cowboys' faces or the strange peace that had settled over the kitchen. She didn't explain how she had taught them the word for salt, or how one of them had pointed to the clouds that morning and asked her what the Japanese word was for sky. There were things too soft to say out loud. Instead, she wrote, "I am okay. I am cooking again. That is enough." She folded the paper carefully, like origami, and handed it off as instructed. A soldier tucked it into a pouch already swollen with other prisoners' words, bound for places none of them would ever see again. But this letter made it farther than most. Weeks later, in Tokyo, under flickering electric lights and the smell of stale ink, a man in uniform read Naomi's words in silence. His job was to censor, to slice out enemy propaganda, to erase weakness, to trim stories into weapons. But this one, this small letter written by a girl whose name he'd never heard, stopped him. He read it once, then again, then leaned back in his chair. Why would they let her cook? Why would Americans, a people trained to see the Japanese as insects, saboteurs, threats, let a teenage girl near their food, let alone their fire? And why, in the name of emperor and country, would they say thank you? The contradictions tangled around his thoughts like vines. He marked the letter for review and passed it to his superior, who passed it to someone higher. The message wasn't political. It wasn't coded. It didn't mention troop positions or American weapons, but it did something worse. It showed kindness. And kindness, they knew, could rot the foundation of hatred. It could confuse soldiers more than bullets ever could. What would happen if others read this? If mothers believed their captured daughters were feeding cowboys and being thanked for it? If children thought there might be decency on the other side of the barbed wire? That was dangerous. So they marked the letter for interception. They never sent it. Keiko never read Naomi's words, never knew about the ribs or the smoke, or the way her sister had found purpose again in the act of feeding others. But Naomi kept writing, even without replies, even knowing they might never arrive. She wrote letters that smelled like kitchen fires and boiled soy, letters filled with silences and truths too gentle for war. And somewhere, tucked away in the drawer of a Japanese censor's desk, sat a folded page that whispered a question no one knew how to answer. What if the enemy isn't always the enemy? The day Naomi left, the sky was a soft, brushed-over gray. Not stormy, not bright, just muted, like the world was holding its breath. She stood beside the cattle gate with the others, their bags slung low, stitched together from old canvas, and stitched silence. No one called it a goodbye. No one dared. The POWs had been processed, cleared, listed on ledgers in neat rows. One by one, names read, heads nodded. Naomi waited near the back of the group, her frame stronger now, no longer paper-thin. Her face was fuller, her posture different. She stood without folding inward. A truck rumbled near the barracks, its tires dusting the earth. Cowboys stood nearby, boots planted, arms crossed. They didn't wave, they didn't smile, but one stepped forward. It was the one who'd first handed her the tongs. He didn't say her name, though maybe by now he knew it. He just held out a small cloth bundle, tied with twine. Naomi took it. Their fingers brushed. "In case," he muttered, eyes low. "You want to make it again." Then he stepped back. She didn't cry. She only nodded, clutched the bundle to her chest like it might slip through her fingers if she let go. The drive to the coast was long. On the ship she was given a cot below deck. It rocked gently with the sea, a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. Around her other girls whispered, some quietly weeping, some staring blankly at nothing. Naomi waited until nightfall. Then she untied the bundle. Inside, a small bag of ground pepper, a pinch of smoked paprika, 2 dried chili flakes, a torn scrap of newspaper that had wrapped them, soaked faintly in the scent of oak and meat and sweat. She held the paper to her face, closed her eyes, inhaled, and there it was, the rib pit, the firelight, the sound of boots crunching dry grass. The laughter that had once broken across the fence line like thunder softened into something else. The first time someone had asked her how to say "thank you" in her language. And the ribs, God, the ribs. She remembered the way they'd watched her tend the fire, the way no one had questioned her hands, her skill, her silence. The night when chewing had been the only sound, when smoke had become a kind of bridge between worlds. She had not left the camp with medals, or papers, or recognition. She left with memory, and memory, it turned out, could be heavier than anything else. When they docked in Japan, she stepped off the ship with the others, the bundle tucked beneath her blouse. Officials shouted orders. Women were sent left and right. Questions flew, names, origins, affiliations. Most answers were mumbled, some never came. Naomi gave only what she had to. She didn't explain the fire, or the tongs, or the way a kitchen had become the only place she'd felt human. There was no place on the form for that, but it didn't matter, because she was not the same girl who'd arrived in Texas weighing barely 70 pounds and carrying nothing but silence. She had been changed, not by what they gave her, but by what she gave them. A fire, a meal, a reason to sit side by side in the dark and remember for a fleeting moment that there had been life before war, and maybe, just maybe, life after it too.